Good evening. Welcome to the opening episode of our third season of the Shift Disturber Speakers Series. My name is Jameson Stevie. I'm the Executive Director of the Martin Prosperity Institute. Where would you rather be than here tonight at the corner of Harbour and St. George on a beautiful fall evening? To John, this is how all of our falls look. It stays this way until late December. So anytime you'd like to move up here to matriculate, please do. Debates are raging, both south of the border, although perhaps a little less content-rich from last night's debate. But tonight, Canadians will sit wrapped around their televisions as an economic debate proceeds between our federal leaders. So it's timely that we have John here this evening. John is going to present tonight on the basic argument from a book that he's writing with support from the MPI titled 3 Stories About Capitalism. He's going to start with a big history view of capitalism and explain why it is so politically divisive. Our structure for tonight, John will come up and speak for about the first 40 to 45 minutes. He'll be joined on stage by Roger, and then we will enter into a Q&A session. So for those of you who aren't familiar with our speakers tonight, John Haidt is a social psychologist at the NYU Stern School of Business. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1992 and spent most of his career at the University of Virginia. He has written such books as The Happiness Hypothesis and the New York Times bestseller, The Righteous Mind. Roger Martin, some of you may be familiar, is the Institute Director here at the Martin Prosperity Institute. From 1998 to 2013, he served as Dean of this school, and previously he spent 13 years as Director of the Monitor Company, a global strategy consulting firm based in Cambridge. And as I wrote in my notes, and he also helped to build a city block, helps companies around the world, and had a profound impact on public policy. But aside from that, he hasn't been up to much over the last little while. So with that, and without further ado, I invite John Haidt to join the stage. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jameson. I actually would like to start off with a little snippet of conversation I had with my cab driver on the way in from the airport this morning. He asked me if I was going to give a talk at the university, and I said yes. He said, on what? I said, on capitalism. And he said, oh. And I said, well, what do you think about capitalism? And here's what he said. Let's see if this will play. So what do you think about capitalism?
I think capitalism is not good because money just goes to top people or some people or certain number of people. The rest of the society people, they just suffer for the food, dying for the food. They don't have resources. They don't have, access to the food. So we should, as a society, if you care as a society, we should look after others as well. Then we can build a good society.
Okay, so I'm kicking myself for shutting off the recorder at that point, because he'd given this really articulate condemnation of capitalism. And then I said, so why did you move to Canada? And he said, oh, so that I could build a better life for my children. In Pakistan, a taxi driver can't do anything. He can't save up any money. But here you can make a good life for yourself. I said, okay, well, is Canada a capitalist country? Oh, no. Well, yes. And it went on from there. But my point, and the reason I'm starting with this, is because capitalism has a real image problem. The word itself generally has negative associations, although I'll show you it depends for whom. But yet, the world is, people are risking their lives doing anything they can to get to the capitalist countries, the countries that have had certain forms of capitalism for the longest time. So it's a real conundrum here. I think that getting capitalism right, understanding it, and figuring out ways to make it work better for all is the greatest challenge of the 21st century. And that's why I'm so pleased to be here. I was so thrilled to meet Roger a year and a half ago and to find out about MPI, because this is, I think, the most important intellectual task. One of the most important things that academics can do, certainly in the social sciences, is help people think more clearly about capitalism. So I'm thrilled to be an MPI fellow. I'm grateful for the support that MPI gave me for a trip I took across Asia that I'll tell you about just a little bit. And now I'll tell you about this book that I'm trying to write and the ideas I'm trying to develop and think through. And we'll have, Roger and I will talk at the end, and I hope we'll have some time for questions as well. So the book that I'm trying to write, I just made up this cover a few days ago. But let me just tell you briefly the backstory and how I got here, because I think it I guess some of the transformations that I went through, they may be things that some of you have gone through or might go through. So my first book was called The Happiness Hypothesis. It was a book about the major psychological insights that the ancients had. I put them all together in a book, and I evaluated them as a social psychologist. Are they true? And one of them is that people are self-righteous hypocrites. Why do you complain about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you cannot see the plank in your own? Boy, is that an insightful and true statement. We're self-righteous hypocrites. We're argumentative. We need to be less judgmental. So that was one of the themes of my first book. But that led directly into my second book, which is really more on my own research, which is on moral judgment, political tribalism and controversy, how we're all just hypocrites who are overly judgmental of the other side and therefore can't understand the other side and therefore can't think clearly about politics. So that was my second. Now, when I finished that book, my second child had just been born a year before. I knew I couldn't travel much to promote it. And I thought, well, I've got to get to New York somehow. I've got to spend the next year in New York if I want to actually promote this book. The psychology department, they don't have any money. I gave a talk at the business school once. Let me call up some people at Stern. I have no interest in business whatsoever, but, couldn't I teach business ethics? So I called up the guy who ran the ethics area and said, hey, Bruce Buchanan, you remember me? I'd love to be in New York for a year. Is there any way I could come to New York and teach at Stern? He said, that would be great. We'd love to have you. So he made it all happen, and most importantly, got me a subsidized New York apartment. That's the key to anything in New York. So it's 2011. I moved to New York City, and I'm very excited. It's really fun. I hang out in the psychology department. I have no particular interest in business. Then I start teaching, here's Stern. So I start co-teaching with Bruce, the basic professional responsibility course at Stern. It's an ethics class. We go through conflict of interest and fiduciary duty and privacy, all sorts of issues. And I'm learning about all the terrible things that businesses do, all the horrible binds they put their employees in and throw them under the bus to sacrifice them to avoid fines for the firm, all this stuff. One day, this is September 17th, 2011, I open the New York Times, and I start reading the business section. I hadn't done that before. And every article is on businessmen behaving badly. You've got conflicts of interest. You've got a rogue trader at the top blowing $2 billion of UBS's money. Conflict of interest insider trading, a professor. You've got something of a scandal about the role of the Madoff attorney. And this is just the top half of the page. On the bottom half, you have a bond manager who also had a conflict. So it's like, wow, business is just a snake pit of vice. Okay? And what else happens on September 17th, 2011? You probably don't have that date etched in your memory, but that's the date that Occupy Wall Street began. The very day that Occupy Wall Street began happened to be this day that I noted as a really bad day for business ethics. So I'm in New York City. I ride my bicycle. I take my son to playgrounds. We're actually not far from Occupy. Let's go check it out. And so I go down a few times to have conversations with people. And it's not just Occupy. It spreads globally. This is London. This is Paris. So all over the world, the developed, the capitalist world, people are saying capitalism really is not working. It's, again, just a snake pit of it. It's exploitation. It's awful, awful stuff. In America, everyone's really focused for several years now on rising inequality, how the gains from productivity have almost all gone to the top few percent, and that's what the taxi driver was saying. Capitalism generates money. It all gets siphoned off by the top. So the imagery of Occupy Wall Street is of predation, exploitation. There was a famous article, was it in Rolling Stone? It's a giant vampire squid wrapped across the face of humanity, ramming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. That, I think, was about Goldman Sachs, but capitalism more generally. So, the truth to this, right? Okay, well, meanwhile, back at Stern, I am attending some events. This is Dean Peter Henry. This is his motto for Stern. We develop people and ideas that transform the challenges of the 21st century into opportunities to create value for business and society. Yada, yada, buzzwords, buzzwords. Everybody's talking about creating value, creating value. I don't pay it any mind. But I do think, I should learn something about capitalism. And so I happened to see these lectures by the Teaching Company, by a really brilliant intellectual historian whose work I'd read before. I said, if Jerry Mueller is going to lecture on capitalism, I'll listen. So I listened to these lectures, and it just blows my mind. I learn about things. This is a wonderful quote from Voltaire that he gives us. Go into the London Stock Exchange, and you'll see representatives from all nations gathered together for the utility of men. Here, Jew, Mohammedan, and Christian deal with each other as though they were all of the same faith, and only apply the word infidel to people who go bankrupt. So capitalism builds the modern world of tolerance. People learn, put aside our religious differences. Keep those private. I don't care what you do privately. We can work together. Well, that's beautiful. In the 18th century, there's a real realization that capitalism changes people mostly for the better. Commerce is a pacific system, or a peacemaking system, operating to cordialize mankind by rendering nations as well as individuals useful to each other. Well, that's actually another way of saying creating value. Everybody is thinking, what can I do that would be useful to someone else, that they might actually pay me money? And when we do that, the world now has more value in it. So this concept begins to make some sense to me. And then I come across this graph. We've all seen versions of it, but this particular way of laying it out really blew my mind. This is, so Angus Madison was an economist who collected data on, or tried to quantify exactly where each country and continent was over the last few millennia in terms of wealth per capita. And what you see here graphed out is GDP per capita in constant $1990 from the year 1 through 1950. And I've labeled here the blue line is Western Europe, and you see that from the year 1 onwards, everybody was living, that's about $300 or $400 a year. Basically, everyone in the world is living on about $1 a day of 1990 money, near starvation level, except for the kings and princes. But everybody in the world is very poor. And then the Western Europeans develop not just ships, they make great advances in ship, develop innovations in banking and the corporate structure. And they're able to launch missions to the rest of the world that bring stuff back, that move stuff around. They don't make anything. But a bunch of cinnamon in Indonesia isn't worth very much. Move it to London, and it's worth the equivalent of millions today. So they move stuff around, and that generates vast, you're creating value out of nothing, just moving stuff. And as you can see, that world-changing fact, you see Western Europe shoots up above the rest of the world. Western Europe is so rich compared to the rest of the world. And that sets up the long dominance of Europe throughout the whole world, right there. So you see it right there in the graph. But, of course, that is nothing compared to the effects of industrial capitalism. Because when the British and then the Americans surpassed them quickly, when the West learns how to make stuff with division of labor, water power, and then coal power, now you're really creating new stuff. You get such a tidal wave of value creation that America in particular becomes rich, becomes the first middle-class nation, the first nation to create mass prosperity in human history. Now, I've stopped the graph at 1950 because that story is so dramatic, but it's nothing compared to what happened after 1950 to everybody. America goes further in the second half of the 20th century than the rest of the world had ever created value in all of history. And then Western Europe, and then Japan. As we all know, this incredible miracle, out of the ashes of the war, they rise right up there. Western Europe with them. And of course, as we know, China, India, Africa, these are all rising as well. So I see this, and I say, oh my God, that's what it means to create value. Everybody does their little bit, and it adds up to this. A really dramatic illustration of this is what happened in China. China is incredibly poor throughout the 20th century. Mao comes in, the country's devastated. Great leap forward, and GDP doesn't budge. 30 to 50 million people die of starvation because he shuts down markets and prices. All right, the Chinese are flexible. They ditch that. Cultural revolution. Nothing. Now fewer people die, but a lot of people go to jail. Nothing on GDP. Deng Xiaoping says, poverty is not socialism. Let us try a little bit free market in Shenzhen. And bang, instantly, not instantly, it takes 2 or 3 decades, China is suddenly a major power again. So capitalism creates conditions under which so much value is created that everything changes. Here's another demonstration. North Korea and South Korea. I think North Korea was actually a little richer per capita than South Korea in 1950. But this is the view from space. And what are the odds that all these white dots, which are electric light, what are the odds statistically that they'd all just happen to cluster south of the DMZ? I don't know the odds, but this is an extremely large effect size with a very, very low p-value. So again, you can see this capitalism from outer space with your naked eye. And it's not just that the rich are getting richer, it's that poverty plummets. This is a graph showing the percentage of people living on, in this particular data set, it's $1.25 a day of constant, like $1995 or $2,000, so roughly modern time. So this is the percentage of the world living in extreme poverty. So in 1820, 95% it's estimated were living in extreme poverty. And we get the 19th century into the 20th century, and it goes gradually down. We're talking the population of the world is growing and growing and growing, but poverty is declining. But look what happens again after 1950, after the Second World War. Prosperity really gets going. The pace accelerates. Poverty is declining so fast on this planet that it's estimated outside of sub-Saharan Africa, which is following a different trajectory, but it's the same direction. Outside of sub-Saharan Africa, extreme poverty is almost gone, and it will be gone in the next decade or two. I mean, individuals, but in terms of a percentage of humanity, very, very low. So this is arguably the biggest moral fact on the positive side in human history. And we've got a couple of huge negative facts, but this is an incredibly important story. This is fantastic. And it's not just that people are not poor. It's not just that they're eating. They're happier. Money really, really does buy happiness. Journalists loved to report a while ago that it didn't because you could sort of squint at the data and say that it doesn't, but it actually really, really does. So the World Bank, Hellawell, Layard, and Jeff Sachs have gathered together all this Gallup data, and they've done a brilliant job of doing psychological analyses and economic analyses. I won't show you all the analyses, but basically this is a map of happiness, of self-reported happiness. And as a first approximation, this is also a map of GDP per capita. Now, the long exception is that the Latin Americans are happier than their wealth would predict. They're always the outliers. But if you want to understand how happy a country is, the most important factor to know is GDP per capita. There are 5 other factors that they add in, but that accounts for the biggest share of the variance. So wealth really, really matters for human happiness, flourishing, trust, engagement, all those things. So an image I found on the internet says it all. Capitalism, it just works. So there's a lot of truth to this story. So which is it? Which story is true? They can't both be true. Or can they? It's, as a first approximation, if we know what side of the political divide you're on, we know which story you embrace. So this is data from Americans, those who say they're both liberal and Democrat, which is increasingly the same thing. So conservative Republicans have a very positive view, 66% positive of capitalism, whereas Americans on the left are totally ambivalent. They're just as likely to think it's bad as good. So the American left is split. The American right is very pro-capitalism. Socialism is sort of the opposite. The American right really hates socialism, the term, the concept, everything about it, and the American left likes it more than capitalism. So as a first approximation, it's a political divide. The left, for centuries, has disliked business, disliked capitalism. If you go almost anywhere else on this campus, outside the business school, and you poll people, academic areas generally are anti-capitalism. Not in the economics department, but elsewhere in the humanities and social sciences. So what I began to realize is that all this work I was doing on political psychology and the left-right divide over abortion and gay rights and all those things I was writing about in The Righteous Mind, well, in 2011, the world changed, the culture war changed, and in the United States, it became overwhelmingly about economic issues. And suddenly, I got really interested in business and capitalism and economics because I began seeing you can't understand these things without knowing something about moral psychology. And I began to see, as I was sensitized to this, I began to see these coherent worlds that the left built and that the right built. And that reminded me of one of my favorite quotes from the social sciences. Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, writes, sort of summarizing Max Weber a little bit in Geertz's words. He says, "Man is an animal suspended in webs of significance that he himself has spun. We create these cultural worlds of meaning, and then we live in them, and we can't see outside them. So if the left builds one web of meaning, one moral matrix, and the right builds another one, they can't understand each other." That's what we have in the United States. Many countries are getting that way, many are not. But the metaphor of the Matrix, literally, the movie The Matrix, if you saw those science fiction movies, the Matrix is a consensual hallucination. That's what morality is. It's a consensual hallucination. We all live within certain moral worlds, and then we get really passionate about them. We hate the people who violate our morals. We see the world as good versus evil. And so I began seeing these two different worlds about capitalism, and I decided to I used to give talks where I'd show PowerPoint slides trying to illustrate it all. I decided, why don't I try making a video? So I hired a small production company to animate them. Let me show you these videos. They're 90 seconds long. What I'm trying to convey is they're kind of cartoonish. I hope you'll enjoy them, but just look at them, listen to them, and see which one resonates with you, which one sort of feels right and familiar to you. Okay, Dave, let's give this a try on the audio.
Once upon a time, work was real and authentic. Farmers raised crops, and craftsmen made goods with their own hands. But then, capitalism was invented, and darkness spread across the land as the smokestacks of the Industrial Revolution covered everything in soot. The capitalists became ever more skilled at extracting productivity from workers and pocketing the gains from their labor. The workers eventually fought back by unionizing. In the early 20th century, as the brutality and stupidity of capitalism were exposed, many governments granted workers protection from the predators. Democratic welfare states were born. But the capitalists and their right-wing cronies were unrelenting. And in many countries, they have destroyed the unions, slashed regulations, and given the corporations free rein to exploit at will. So, the rich get richer, the rest of us get poorer, our democracy gets weaker, and the planet gets hotter. It is now the duty of every decent person to join the fight against global capitalism and the super predators it has unleashed upon us.
Okay, so how did that feel to you? Does that feel true? Does it feel like, that it sort of captures what has happened in history? Now I'll show you the second story, and note that it has exactly the same structure. I literally wrote out the different slots in the story, and I just filled them with different content, and sometimes the same images.
Once upon a time, almost everyone was a peasant, a serf, or a slave. Kings and feudal lords took most of what people produced, so nobody had much reason to work hard. But then, in the 17th century, capitalism was invented, and the liberation began. In England, Holland, and America, they discovered that when you give people property rights, the rule of law, and free markets, you turn on a switch in their hearts. People want to work when they can keep the fruits of their labor. They want to invent new products, provide for their children, and be useful to others. Free market capitalism enables them to do these things. In the 20th century, some countries embraced communism and centralized planning, always with the same result: shortages of everything, including food and freedom. But countries that embraced capitalism have grown prosperous in a single generation. Yet, despite the evidence of history, the left-wing egalitarians are unrelenting, and whenever they get control of a government, their first target is economic freedom. The egalitarians don't want to live in a world in which people who create more value for others get to enjoy more wealth for themselves. They'd rather that everyone be equal and equally poor. It is now the duty of every decent person to join the fight to protect capitalism and to extend its blessings to all of humankind.
Okay, how did that one feel? So if you have to vote for which one resonates with you more, they're both cartoons, but which one, if you have to pick one as being the one that resonates with you more, please raise your hand if it was the first one, the exploitation story. Okay? And now raise your hand if it's the second one, the liberation story. Okay, so so here the liberation story gets more votes, but this is a business school, so it's not so surprising. I've shown this in a lot of places, and I often will take the time to say, okay, who's on the left? And the left overwhelmingly prefers the first story. Who's on the right? And both of the people in the audience who are on the right will prefer the liberation story. So these are closed moral worlds that have whole networks of meaning. So if this is the case, if we really are locked into these separate networks of meaning, these separate stories about capitalism, what will it take for us to work together and work more productively to improve capitalism in modern societies? Do we need a third story? And I think that we do. It's not going to be radically different. It's not going to be something you haven't heard of. But I think we do need a different story. And I'm going to just suggest to you now 3 points that I think need to be true about this story. I don't know what the story is just yet. I have a few ideas that I'll close with. But here are 3 things that I think should be true about this story. The first is that it needs to reflect the basic truth, and this is from the happiness hypothesis, that because our minds are so dualistic, we tend to be Manichaeans who believe in good and evil. The third story should integrate elements of both of the stories. There should be both stories are right about a lot of things. And so whatever this third story is, it needs to be integrative in a kind of a yin-yang way. That doesn't mean they're both equally right, but it needs to integrate elements from both. A shorthand that I've come to use that I found is very helpful as I travel around the world doing research for the book is that wherever you go, every society is concerned about decency, like treating people well, and dynamism. Basically, that's what capitalism is. It's motivating people to work hard. And if you don't motivate people to work hard, then it doesn't work. So you have to have both decency and dynamism. And wherever you go, the left is more concerned about decency and is often willing to sacrifice some dynamism. And the right is more concerned about dynamism and is willing to sacrifice some decency. So I think that's very much a yin-yang sort of thing. And they are inversely correlated on average, but not always. There are a lot of things you can do that actually increase both. When you get basic safety for workers, so the Bangladeshi garment workers aren't being killed by the hundreds. That doesn't reduce your dynamism, and boy, does it increase your decency. So there are a lot of ways, if you keep these 2 in mind, you actually can increase them both. And that's, I think, the goal of good policy. The second feature of this story is that it has to help us answer what I would call the $100 trillion question. And let me explain what that is. So I showed you this graph of how amazingly quickly value is rising. The quantity of stuff that we have to divide among the people is growing so rapidly around the world. I found this one graph, this World Bank data. This is the gross world product. If you just add up total value in constant 2005 dollars, back in 1960 there was $10 trillion of value on this planet. And as you see, it's shooting up and shooting up and shooting up. And within a decade or two, we'll have $100 trillion worth of stuff. It's kind of fun to look at this. So this was especially America and the West. This is especially China and the rest of Asia. Oh, look, there's the global financial crisis. What a gigantic catastrophe that was. It sure felt like it, but it was just a blip. We're still going up and up and up. So we'll soon be at $100 trillion. And so is that all we care about? Is that the goal? Just more and more and more? America was the first mass prosperity society in human history, and Americans celebrated the fact that we got lots of stuff. And that was the American dream. Lots of stuff. Even a guy with just a high school education and a union factory job could have lots of stuff. A guy with a high school education, if he saved up, he could afford these beautiful, beautiful cars. And women were liberated from the drudgery of doing laundry by hand, and life in the kitchen, life at home, domestic life was completely reshaped by technology and prosperity. And as this was all going on, it was all new, this incredible prosperity, there were voices saying, is this all there is? The most eloquent of those voices was Robert Robert F. Kennedy, the president's younger brother. This is from a talk that he gave, a speech that he gave just a couple months before he was assassinated. He said, "The gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. GDP measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile." And I think people in almost every modern society get chills of recognition when they read these lines. So the $100 trillion question, I think, is what is a flourishing capitalist society in the 21st century? Yes, it requires prosperity, it requires a lot of value, but there's got to be more. This third story has to help us understand what else there is. What are we doing with all this money? How do we live our lives such that people generally feel like, you know what, things are pretty good, and our society is pretty good. So how do we do that? And here's the kicker. This is an almost impossible question to answer because capitalism and prosperity change us and change our values so quickly that whatever answer we come up with may not work for our children because they're going to be different from us. Let me explain why. This was one of the most exciting things I learned in my trip across Asia, was just how everything changes in a similar direction. So whatever this third story is, it must work in the uncharted territory of the future. People living in ways that nobody's ever lived in before. What is that going to do to their values, to their to the things that they want? So some of you may have heard of the World Values Survey. It's been running since the 1980s. It's a really great survey. They ask hundreds of questions. They take representative samples in each country. They're now up to almost 100 countries every 6 or 8 years. And they ask all kinds of questions about democracy, gender, religion, all these issues that might help public policymakers understand what's happening in their country. So it's a really great data set. It's all publicly available. Just Google it. You can download it. Melissa Pogue has been playing with it here. If you have questions on it, just come to her. She's sick and tired of it. No, she's making great progress in really digging into it. And here's the way to summarize their finding. They have some great papers on this, but here I'll just summarize the main finding. What they do is they compute an average for each country on all, let's say, 150 questions. And then you just do a multidimensional scaling. So you look at how similar are the countries to each other, and you have the computer plot in two-dimensional space, put the countries that are like each other next to each other, and those that are not like each other far apart. And it tries to maximize the fit, and here's what it comes up with. You can't read the country names. I'll just tell you some of them. So the Islamic countries and African countries in the bottom left, Scandinavian countries are Protestant Europe in the upper right, Sweden in the upper right corner. The English-speaking countries, you can see, are here. The USA is here. So what do these dimensions mean? That's the key. So there's two dimensions. The way to think about it is this. Agricultural countries start with survival values versus emancipative, and traditional values versus secular rational. So they're almost always religious. There's a lot of devotion to gods and rituals. It's very inefficient, but that's what people do, especially in agricultural societies. And because life is so dangerous, and you could starve to death, and you can be killed by raiders and your own government even, people are really just concerned about survival, getting money, burying the money somewhere where people can't steal it. But what happens? So countries go from being poor and having these survival values and traditional religious values, as they become wealthier, they move up, but they don't move diagonally. Here's the key. Here's the really interesting fact, or what Engelhardt and Wilson say. There's actually a two-step process. As they leave agricultural behind and they industrialize, they now have to fit into the machine. So you can't do ritual. Ritual conflicts with the needs of the machine. So they get much less religious. They become much more rational, much more secular. Time matters. Punch the clock. This, I think, is the step that gives capitalism a bad name, especially on the left all around the world. It's ugly. It's materialist. People want stuff. I saw this all over Asia. I could not believe the amount of money that Asians are wasting on European luxury brands. It's sickening, really. I mean, Louis Vuitton is, in every city, all these new growing cities in Asia, it seems like Louis Vuitton is like Starbucks here. So everybody's pursuing status, and status is money, and money impresses people. So it's really ugly. It's materialism. And that's the initial flush of wealth. But if you just wait a few generations, the economy changes more to a service economy. And the skills and virtues you need to be successful in a service economy are dealing with people, empathy, creativity, not just order and fitting into the routines of a factory. And the values change along with it. So here's what they find. They find that, this is from a really powerful book that I'm reading now by Christian Welzer, one of the main authors. So they point especially to, we're fine on time. They point especially to the role of existential threats. When you grow up with existential threats, that is the chance that you could be killed, the chance that there will be a famine, the chance that an earthquake will destroy everything, that really affects people's values. And as modern, wealthier societies are able to insulate people from those, and there are no more existential threats, very few of us actually worry about dying in the next couple of weeks. I mean, it's really very unlikely. As those threats recede, values change. Here's his summary. These fading existential pressures open people's minds, making them prioritize freedom over security. They don't care as much about security anymore. They prioritize autonomy over authority, diversity over uniformity, and creativity over discipline. In a lot of ways, people's values shift leftward, politically, frankly. They begin to care about women's rights, human rights, gay rights, animal rights, and the environment. This only happens when people are freed from existential threats. People are worried about starvation and dying. They don't care about the environment. They don't care about human rights far away. Those are not their issues, on average. And there are all kinds of other benefits. So this is the basic story that they find. I'll just illustrate. When I spent a lot of time, especially in China, Korea, and Japan, and so I would show this graph, and it's really interesting to think about it in these terms. So, like, for example, Korea had this fantastic burst of prosperity and success. Then they kind of hit the skids in '97, and things have been slower, and they're very reflective. They're like, how can we get the magic back? What's going on? What's happening to us? What's happening? And so the Chinese culture countries, which includes Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, they had this real burst of industrialization. They got wealthy. But what's going to happen next? Well, one possibility is they could follow the path of Japan. Japan industrialized so far ahead of the rest of Asia. Once they were an isolationist country, once the American Navy sort of burst them open and said, "You got to trade with us," boy, did they embrace industrialization, and boy, did they do it well and quickly and successfully. So Japan is way ahead of the rest of Asia in terms of time, and this is where their values are. They're sort of on the path to Sweden. So maybe that's what's going to happen. Maybe all these countries here, their children will be here, and their grandchildren will be here, and their great-grandchildren. So maybe that's what's happening. We don't really know. But the general sweep is this way, this kind of curve. And so this is why what I saw, I was in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, Singapore, Malaysia, China, Korea, Japan, Indonesia. I went across a lot of countries, Hong Kong. And everywhere I went, people talked about how different the young people are and how incredibly fast things are changing. The generation gap that we had in America and Canada after World War II, with the baby boomers and the greatest, I mean, that was a big generation gap. What's happening all across Asia is so much larger than what we ever experienced in the West. The change is so much more rapid. So just a quote from, here's one, an economics professor in Seoul. He said, well, there are 3 generations of students that I've taught. Those born in the 70s, their formative years were fighting the dictatorship. And they're still influenced by that struggle. They have values related to that. Those born in the 1980s were raised without any problems. There was no more dictatorship. There was democracy. There was rising prosperity. It was the 386 generation, they called them, from the Intel processor, the 386. So he understands them. But then he said, then there are those who were born in the 1990s, who are the current students. And he said, I haven't figured them out yet. He said, they're not Koreans. Their values are so different from the generations that remember the war and the starvation and the struggle and the danger. These kids, they're not Korean. I heard things like this in many countries. Conversely, here's a young woman in Korea. Most of the older people don't want change. They want to keep things as they are. They have a fear of change. My generation, they want to make change. They want to make a new society. So this is the way things go. Once you unlock capitalism and you get it working, you get such rapidly rising prosperity and such decreasing existential threats that your kids seem like aliens to you. So now let's think about what kind of society we want. Boy, is that difficult. But whatever this third story about capitalism is, it has to help us with that. So here are the 3 points I've just made. In our thinking going forward, what kinds of societies do we want? Or what's the third story, I should say? One feature is it's going to need to draw, I think, it's going to need to draw elements from both sides. Frankly, I think the liberation story is closer to the truth. You can start with that and improve it. I don't think there's a way to start with the exploitation story and then just modify it to get something that works. If you think that capitalism is fundamentally exploitation, and now we're just going to make it less exploitative, there's no way forward from that. But if you think that capitalism is fundamentally about creating value, about liberating people to pursue their interests, and then you say, on the other hand, there's still lots of bad stuff that happens, let's try to reduce that, I think that's a better way forward. So, but it has to acknowledge that there's truth on both sides. It has to lead us to a society that is widely felt to be flourishing. And this is the big problem with rising inequality. On the left, in America, people really seem to believe that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Actually, raise your hand. I should, now it's too late, but raise your hand if you think that in the last 20 or 30 years, the poor in Canada have gotten poorer. Okay, I don't know what the story is in Canada. In America, where many people think that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting richer, what's actually happening is the poor are getting richer, but very slowly. And the rich are getting richer really quickly. So everybody's actually going up. But on the left, they don't know that because they're so committed to the idea that capitalism is exploitation. Anyway, so but inequality is crucial. If everybody's really getting better off, it's just a whole different game. There's a lot more room for working together. And third, whatever story we come up with, it has to work in the future. And the future, we have some guesses as to how our kids will be different. They will be more egalitarian. They will value creativity more and authority less. So we can actually make some guesses based on current trends. But it's like a four-dimensional chess game. It's really difficult. I'll just close with one of what I think is one of the best things I've heard said about capitalism. David Schmitz he's actually a libertarian philosopher at the University of Arizona. He gave a talk at Stern while I was going through all this, like, wow, this is amazing stuff. He gave a talk in which he had this offhand line. He doesn't even remember saying it, but I checked with him, and he's okay with me quoting him as saying this. He said, at its best, a free market society is a game that you can only win by making other people better off. That's just so simple. And it's also obviously not the society that we currently live in. There are ways to get rich that don't make other people better off. I gave a version of this talk, or some parts of it, at a conference in Korea. Jack Ma spoke there, and he was the founder of Alibaba, one of the richest men in China. And he said the secret of success is help others. If you go to work every day, if you think always, how can I help others? You will be successful. Now, that isn't true in many countries. I mean, there are many countries in which that is not true. I wouldn't try that in Russia. But that's the name of the game, is can we get things to the point where this is true? Again, once you're sensitized to this stuff, you see it everywhere. So this is on the plane on the way up. I'm reading the New York Times. Nick Kristof has a column about Johnson & Johnson, which is generally thought of as a very ethical company over many decades. It's generally thought to be a good company. But the current CEO promoted after he's the guy who made the decision to market risperidol, which is a psychiatric drug, in ways that were really devious, that involved a lot of false advertising, a lot of using money to influence regulation, to buy off doctors, and lots of lives were ruined. It affects hormones. A lot of boys grew gigantic breasts. It caused strokes among the elderly. I mean, lots of people's lives were really harmed by this. And they were fined a lot of money. Boy, were they punished. Net, they made $12 billion. $18 billion in profits, $6 billion fine. So we do not live in a world in which the only way to get ahead is to make other people better off. But this is why it's an eternal game of regulation and not regulate. I mean, this is the challenge. How do you get to that point? So this brings us to my last slide, is simply to bring up some of the issues that I'm studying, that I'm talking about with the folks at MPI. At MPI, they talk a lot about different kinds of infrastructure. And an idea that I'm trying to develop with them is that there's what you might call moral infrastructure. There are certain kinds of norms and values about hard work, about trust, personal responsibility, honesty. There are certain kind of norms that are going to, and policies and institutions that will make your society more one in which the only way you can win the game is to make other people better off. So that, I hope, is our segue into our discussion with Roger. Thank you.
Great stuff, as I expected, Jonathan. A bunch of things, stuff struck me that I'd love to talk about. But one of them is just this, it's kind of integrative third way notion. This, of course, is something near and dear to my heart, and we've worked a lot at the school on that notion of whether when you're facing an either or, what do you do that's better than choosing, and this between decency and dynamism. And I guess I'm interested in your sense of what about the environment out there is now working to make that harder to come to a third way, and so that it's sort of discouraging and daunting. And what do you see out there in the world that is actually encouraging? That you sort of say, I see this, and it causes me to believe that the third way is more possible. So what's the negative and what's the positive out there right now?
That's a great question. I have two that come right to mind, but I won't learn anything from saying the things I already believe. So I'll give my two, and then maybe you or someone else can give some as well.
Yeah.
So what makes it harder? Is political polarization. Because if already these two stories are politically valent, left-right, and what's happening in the United States, and I was surprised to find in Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, a lot of places, many democracies tend to get more polarized over time. The political divisions get nastier. Each side hates the other side more. And so that's very clearly documented in the United States, what's called affective partisan polarization, the dislike that people on the left have for the right is really growing rapidly since the 90s. To the extent that people on the left now really hate people on the right and vice versa, their story is like, you might as well embrace Adolf Hitler. I mean, no, we're not going to integrate Hitler and Gandhi. No. So political polarization is really damaging, and that's what I'm very worried about for my country. All of our institutions are getting polarized. They're getting purified. The academy has gone from leaning left in almost every field to being 100% left in many fields, which means that the Republicans now want to defund them. Why should we spend taxpayer money on psychology and sociology and political science? Just a bunch of left-wing. So anyway, this polarization is destroying a lot of our institutions, and it's going to make it harder for us to talk about capitalism. A hopeful sign is that the millennial generation, exactly as Welzel and Engelhardt have been predicting since the 90s, the millennial generation wants more out of life. They expect more out of their employers. And this is the really encouraging thing. I graduated from college in 1985, height of the bull market. I graduated from Yale University. I mean, everybody was trampling over each other to get those investment banking jobs because of the money. People didn't really care about making a difference in the world. The money was so tempting. And millennials are not like that at all. And so I know you have an initiative here, or you've been talking with Zeynep Tan, the good job. I mean, jobs. Young people want to work for companies that are doing good, that are helping people. So I think actually, generationally speaking, the wind is at our backs. The trends are this way. Capitalism, I think, is going to mostly get better as companies have to be better in order to hire talent. So those are my two. Do you have any?
Well, yeah. I mean, I would add to the first one. I guess I think the number one reason why people don't try to come up with something better than decency or dynamism is they believe that their intellectual job is to choose. Yeah. I think we've just trained, everybody to think you're supposed to choose. And I'm impartial. I like Samantra Ghoshal. I don't know if you know. He wrote this article. He passed. It was a posthumous article. He died of a brain hemorrhage, and this article was published where he blamed the economists
Who is
for
this?
this.
Who are you talking
Samantra Ghoshal. He was a LBS professor. He wrote this article that said, it was about business schools and business education, that economics has taken over business education, and the fundamental premise in economics is trade-offs. Everything is a trade-off.
That's right.
And so his argument was kind of a cool argument, I thought, which said, if you're trained that everything is a trade-off, then you go out and make everything a trade-off, and then the world appears to be one in which, yes, indeed, everything is a trade-off. So it was a double hermeneutic, self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing. And so I think that I think is actually a big challenge, which is that if somebody saw your slides, decency or dynamism, their reaction, the first reaction is to think my job is to pick one of those sides. In some sense, I loved your stories because your stories play entirely into that. You know, they were both compelling, and so you in their own ways, and so it sort of compels you to say it's okay to choose one or the other. So that would be the one that I would say is a real hurdle. And I think it tends to reinforce your polarization point. It's a good reason to polarize in the way you've described, because if you think your job is to choose, then you want to obviously choose the better answer, and the way to say my answer is better is to say what? The other guys are morons, or the other guys are jerks, and then try to live your life to confirm that's the case.
But what makes you optimistic then? What's something that tells you that things are going to get better?
Well, it would be that have figured out that you can absolutely teach people to seek a third way, and the thing that I'm absolutely most excited about by far is we can teach that in the K through 12 system, and people at that level will take to it and construct their life in a different way, or at least that's the initial results. And we've been hanging around with a lot of teachers, elementary school and secondary school teachers, and we have teachers who are teaching as young as grade 2, teaching the techniques for saying, if you're facing an either-or choice, instead of choosing, here's the set of thinking steps you go through to come up with a better choice.
Oh, wow.
And they can absolutely do it. They like doing it better. They're happy about the results. So that for what it's worth makes me optimistic.
Okay.
What makes me less optimistic, right, is that they do as good a job at it as MBA students. And what that says to me is, holy smokes, what are we doing between grade 2 and MBA that makes them not one iota better at doing that than a grade 2 student or a grade 6 student or a grade 10 student? And I think the only plausible answer to me is we take them on a journey farther away, because they're more capable in many respects. Their thinking patterns are more formed. They're much more educated. They have much more life experience. So we take them away on a terrible path and have to bring them back, and we bring them back to a place where they would have been naturally when they were in grade 2. That's slightly discouraging. But the other one I'll ask, and then I want to leave time for questions from the audience, is existential threats. I was just sitting there. Listening to you present that slide, and what's the fellow's name who specified the kind of existential?
Christian Welzel is his name.
Awesome. I'm gonna read that forthwith. But I was thinking of it because I hang around with big company CEOs a lot, and 2008-9 was absolutely that. It was absolutely that, and lots of people say, "Oh, it wasn't an existential threat." But I remember having a conversation with P&G's got a brilliant CFO named John Mueller, and he was telling me after Lehman Brothers, when we're talking Procter & Gamble, and they have a commercial paper program, I don't know, probably a $5-10 billion commercial paper program that helps fund them. Their bank, with whom they'd had a relationship for only about 80 years, called them up after that and said, we're not rolling your commercial paper, which would have put them into something damn close to bankruptcy the next week. And so he's a huge proponent of TARP. He said TARP saved America. He said when then they came up with TARP, the banks all said, oh, okay, we can get back, but literally. So I don't think most people realize that it was absolutely an existential threat.
Yeah. So I think that's an open question.
Yeah.
As to whether it truly needs to be something where you think you're going to die, and you have, like PTSD, you can't get just from doing really badly on an exam.
Yes.
PTSD is really like you're being held hostage and you think you're going to be murdered.
Yes.
And so it's an open question.
Yes.
Now, it is certainly the case that if you're part of a community in which there's a sense that things are expanding, then you're more cooperative, all sorts of things happen, and as soon as things reverse and things are contracting, then it's more every man for himself.
Yeah.
So I don't doubt there was a lot of fear, and that business people were bathed in stress hormones for months or for a year or two. So it could well leave a lasting impact. And it'll also be interesting to see whether it leaves a permanent impact, especially on people. Traumatic events especially influence you from about 15 to 30. It's most likely to leave a permanent impact.
Ah, okay.
So it remains to be seen.
Yeah. Because I was thinking, even though those were, can you flip back to your page on after the book about what those impacts were? And I just said those were sort of impacts on just a regular human being. Yeah. And I was saying, man, they're all doing that. They were favoring security, authority, uniformity, discipline. Yeah. That's what came to the fore, and some of the phenomena, one of the reasons for, I believe, based on what you said tonight, there's a bit of a mystery about why has it taken so long for the economy to come back. After this one, the recession was longer and deeper. The corporate spending didn't come back. Investment, they had pulled in their horns for way longer than was normally the case. And you've come up with the best answer yet for why that is.
You're saying business behavior basically changed, and it's not as generative; it's more defensive.
Yes,
and of course, that's not going to. We don't go back on the value creation ladder as quickly.
Yeah, and then really, really, really slowly. And so that was one of my reactions is that he was broadly writing about individuals and what it's those things are happening to corporations and are still, and I think still, I mean, we're talking a half a decade since that crisis, since March 2009, where it was the absolute low spot. That's a long time ago, and I think they're still in sort of existential remainder of existential. And the interesting part of the quote for me is fading. Well, how long will it take to fade? Because it's taking longer to fade than I would have thought. But when you talk to John Mueller, it's like, I understand it. All right, we got 2 questions. We got a mic. Put up your hand if you got a question, and this gentleman, Mr. Stevie, will come and find you. So we'll go there, and then we'll go up here to the front. Yeah,
hi, John. Thanks for a really interesting talk.
Thanks.
I
think so.
Okay. So I was wondering, as I was looking at your description of how people on the right in the U.S. Feel about capitalism, I was trying to reconcile that very kind of optimistic view with the fact that Donald Trump, who's currently, I think, around 30% of Republican primary voters would vote for him were the election to be held tomorrow. He doesn't sound like such an optimist about capitalism. He says explicitly, our best days as a country are behind us. And I think that part of the reason that he's been so successful is that he does tap into this very real feeling on the right that things have gone off track. And I wonder how that affects your bigger picture story.
Sure. So first, the right's embrace of capitalism comes out of the long existential struggle with communism. So the 20th century was a giant battle between capitalism and communism. In America, the right waged that war. The left said, you know what, capitalism is actually pretty bad and communism is not so bad. And so the left never identified with capitalism as a force for good. And to this day, in the academy, there are actually more sociologists who identify as Marxist than identify as either Republican or conservative. You can be a Marxist in the academy today. So that's part of it, is the long struggle against communism. So only the right took that. Secondly, it's not that the right is going to say, business is good no matter what because I love capitalism. It's going to say, real free market capitalism is good. And what we have today is crony capitalism. On that, the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street agree. If you look at polling data of Americans, what you see is that they had sort of mildly positive views of big business and banks in the 90s, and then you get the Enron WorldCom crisis, so big business goes way down to the floor. Banks are still up okay. Then you get the global financial crisis. Banks are down on the floor. But small business is always very respected. So Americans like small business, and they now really dislike big business because they see it as corrupt. So Donald Trump is channeling anger against those who think that America has been perverted, capitalism has been perverted. There's a lot of anger in the country. And again, when you get a shrinking pie and a defensive crouch, people are not generous. And Americans are often generous, or have been generous towards immigrants, but now they are not, especially people on the social conservative right, or the authoritarian right, I should say. So it's a complex historical story as to what distinctions people make, I would say.
We have time for one more, Roger.
Great.
Professor Haidt, thank you very much for your other book, The Happiness Hypothesis.
Thank you.
And I was wondering if you could recommend to us 2 or 3 books to follow up on that one.
On the happiness hypothesis. So the happiness hypothesis was all about ancient wisdom and whether it still applies to our modern lives. So I read all these ancient texts, and I read a lot of psychology. So let's see, to follow up on it, well, I think, reading Buddha, the Dhammapada, is a wonderful book. The Sermon on the Mount. There are certain, Aurelius. So I read a lot of texts, and many of them were really, really boring. But some were just really rich, and those 3 were just, and Epictetus. There are a few that I really would recommend to everybody, and most of them are not long. So read some of those ancient sources; those are fantastic. And in terms of more modern stuff, how many of you are in the business school in some way, shape, or form? Raise your hand. Is this a Rotman crowd mostly? Okay. There's a wonderful book by a man named Gilbert Brim called Ambition. This is one of the wisest things I've read. He writes about life in our modern careers, how we set these goals, we work so hard for them. When we achieve them, we are happy just for a brief period of time, and then like a week later, we're striving for another goal. And why can't we enjoy it? Why are we trapped on this treadmill? So that's a wonderful book for thinking about your career, Ambition by Gilbert Brim, B-R-I-M.
Wonderful.
So in closing, first of all, let's give a warm round of applause for Jonathan LeBlanc.
Nicely done.
In closing, 3 things. First of all, thank you so much for coming this evening with just-in-time lives and all the busy things you can be up to. You chose to come here for a pretty meaty conversation. That's number 1. Number 2, as you can hear next door, there are multiple events happening here at Rotman, and offering up free beverages next door. I believe they are mostly hot as opposed to cold, which is the MPI's normal way. We usually go with the cold side. But if you want to enjoy something next door, please do. And lastly, just our focus this year in our Shift to Service series is on our fellows and those who we have the pleasure of working with. And our next speaker is in October 18th. Nilofer Merchant, often referred to as the Jane Bond of innovation, and she is coming to speak about the power of onlyness and the power of humans in creating value in their companies. So please, hopefully you'll join us then once you come down from your post-turkey stupor for another deep conversation here with the MPI. Thank you so much and have a safe night.